very effective.
I'm sorry, Doug. I thought you always took the first item and I took the second, but we can do this.
You
Welcome.
are ready to go, you guys.
Okay, are we live?
We are live.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to the meeting of the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Commission. I'm Bruce Taylor. I'm the vice chair of this group, and the chair, Doug Kramer. Would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, Doug Kramer. I am appointed by Oregon Department of Ag.
Let's see. Let's introduce the staff here, please, if we could. Robin.
Hi everyone, Robin Meacher, Conservation Easement Specialist for the Oregon Ag Heritage Program.
Taylor.
Taylor Larson, I'm the coordinator for the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program.
Renee. Renee.
Renee's frozen.
Oh, well, let's move on to Nicole.
Hi, everyone. Nicole Bettinardi, OWEB Executive Assistant.
Stephanie.
Good afternoon, Stephanie Page, Deputy Director of OWEB.
Ellen.
Hi, Ellen Ingemels, Grant Support Specialist with OWEB.
And Teresa.
Hi, Teresa DeBartolave, Drought Program Specialist at OWEB.
Okay. And Renee is Renee Davis, who's the manages the land acquisition and special grant programs. And she just disappeared, or at least on my screen, I think. So maybe we'll get her back here. Commissioners here. Let's see who I can see. Amanda.
Good afternoon, Amanda Lowe. I'm the appointed tribal representative appointed by OWEB for the OAHC.
Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy Duncrack, the DLCD representative on the OAHC.
Ed.
Ed Contreras. I'm Fish and Wildlife Representative on the commission.
And Lois, please.
Yes, I'm in my second term. I was appointed by the Ag Board for the state of Oregon and handling water issues.
Laura.
Laura Masterson, organic vegetable farmer, appointed by the Board of Ag.
And Barbara.
Hi there, Barbara Boyer, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board Liaison.
And thank you. And I neglected to say I'm a Fish and Wildlife Commission appointed representative. I think that does it. We have one special guest who, Barbara, who will be, we'll ask you to introduce yourself when we get to that item on the agenda there. I think that unless I'm missing somebody here that I can't see, I think that takes care of the introductions.
And I'll just note, Renee had a power surge at home, so she hopefully will join us once that's restored.
Renee is a power surge.
Oh, I'm glad this is recorded so she can see that later.
Doug, would you like to handle the next item?
And being that I don't have the agenda in front of me, I'm going to assume it's their approval of last meeting's minutes.
It's actually public comment.
Ah, dang it. I hate it when I get it wrong. Okay, is there any public comment?
We do. We have Megan Kempel is on the line right now. Megan, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know how to turn my video on with this Zoom setup, so I'm just gonna be audible. Commissioners, Oregon Agricultural Heritage Commissioners, and Oregon Ag Heritage Program staff. My name is Megan Kempel. I'm Executive Director with Oregon Climate and Agriculture Network. I'm commenting on the final methodology to value benefits of ag conservation practices and providing some recommendations for implementation. I've submitted more detailed written comments as well. I appreciate the practice-based versus outcome-based valuation, because monitoring needed for an outcome-based system would be costly and resource intensive for producers and TA providers to implement. I also appreciate the alignment with NRCS programs throughout the report. Regarding carbon sequestration, I have serious concerns about the report's recommendation to base the value for carbon on the current voluntary market value of carbon credits, including the cost of carbon offsets. Market value is inappropriate and inconsistent with the report's determination of public value of ecosystem services. The $5 to $10 per acre recommended in the report does not reflect the public benefit of carbon sequestration. And it's widely recognized that the voluntary carbon market is not compensating farmers at a level that's meaningful or incentivizing. Prices in the voluntary carbon market are too low. They aren't high enough to be worth farmers' time and effort, and they aren't incentivizing implementation of carbon sequestering practices. This is especially true for small and mid-sized farms where low payment rates per acre definitely do not pencil out. We recommend using the social cost of carbon, which is reflective of public value, and we be more effective as an incentive as well. Regarding implementation, my understanding based on conversations with Taylor is that the next step is some public engagement and then creation of guidance documents related to how to apply and guidance for creation of conservation management plans. I recommend the agency convene some listening sessions with interested parties to get input on qualifying practices, valuation of those practices, timelines, process, and guidance documents. We'll engage in those discussions and we'll engage our network of farmers and ranchers and farm service providers in the process. And several of our partners in the Natural Climate Solutions Coalition will be interested in engaging as well. It's critical for the success of OAHP's Conservation Management Plan grants, which currently rely on renewal of the Natural Climate Solutions funds, that we demonstrate both demand and success by the time the legislature considers renewal of these funds during the 2025 legislative session. Time is of the essence for community engagement and implementation. Orcan and our partners look forward to partnering, working with OAHP to roll this program out as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your consideration of these comments.
Thank you, Megan. Is anyone else on the Zoom call that would like to provide public comment? Please raise your hand now. Okay, we have Ivor. Ivor, go ahead and unmute yourself.
How's that? Is that working?
That.
Great. Yeah, Ivor Kincaid, Farmland Program Director for Oregon Agricultural Trust. I'm just going to keep my comments to just one point, just about the agenda item around evaluation. As you guys go into the proposed evaluation strategies and discuss that, we just wanted to provide one general comment and then one sort of specific comment. The general comment is that the more, sort of as Megan mentioned here, the more that the conservation easement program can sort of be aligned with and parallel NRCS evaluation criteria, we think that's really helpful, because we don't want a project that scores one well with one and not well with the other. So that's sort of a general comment. The specific comments we were thinking is that as you guys consider evaluation criteria for the OAHP, the covenants and easements portion of the program, we think that maybe if you broke it into 4 categories. I know that, like, I heard Bruce Taylor's comments earlier, and also Doug's, about kind of different parts of the state are very different. It's hard to compare them. But I think for organizations that are putting a lot of time and energy into these applications, having some sense of how they're going to pre-score is helpful. And we thought that, as a suggestion, that maybe sticking with the statutory purposes, those 3 purposes of, like, enhancing wildlife habitat and fish and water quality is one. The reducing conversion and fragmentation is another. Sort of sticking with those 3 criteria that are kind of in the purposes of the program. That way we can just have some kind of sense of how well they're going to score on the front end, and obviously, like I mentioned before, the better that they match and kind of are aligned with NRCS's ALE program. That's also really helpful for us. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivor. Do we have anyone else online would like to speak right now? Seeing none, I will hand the mic back to, I believe Doug has this one.
Yep. And I think I'm at the end of public comment, so it goes back to Bruce.
Thank you, Doug. If it seems a little awkward to any of you, we have just slogged through 2 hours of administrative rulemaking here with a 2-minute break. So really, we're sharper than we look and sound. We're paying full attention here. So we're going to demonstrate that by reviewing and approving the minutes from our June 5th, 2024 meeting, which I'm sure everybody has reviewed in detail. And I would be looking for a motion to approve those minutes.
I'll make the motion to approve the minutes of our last meeting.
Thank you, Doug. Second?
Happy to second.
Thank you, Ed. It's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, those in favor of approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 Opposed? The motion passes. Thank you. And it goes back to you, Doug, for technical committee structure.
Okay, what am I doing on that one, Larson? Taylor?
You're passing it to Robin.
Okay.
All right, thanks, folks. So we want to kind of lay out the technical committee process for our application review for the conservation easement and covenant grants from the offering that we just had. So as I think you all know, we had a solicitation cycle that just ended on the 28th of June. And so we, as staff, have been in the process of processing those applications, and they will be kind of presented for review to our technical committee and then available for view through our grant management system as well. But so as I think y'all are aware, our statute and our rules lay out a process of essentially we use an evaluation committee to help, or a technical committee that evaluates and ranks the project applications. And so what we have done this year is as staff, we kind of developed a roster of the types of expertise that are relevant to the applications in front of us and that we expected in front of us, as well as kind of just the program purposes and what we are funding. And so we developed a roster of that, and that ranged from individuals with fish and wildlife expertise, soil science, rangeland ecology, and we have an OSU agronomist as well on that roster for our technical committee, and then a land use expert to participate as well. And so with that roster, essentially, we have reached out to all of the folks that kind of match that expertise area. To this point, we have 7 folks that have eight that have now confirmed that they are willing to participate in this evaluation committee. These are all volunteers, so their willingness to review 10 applications and participate in a review team meeting where they will kind of discuss and rank these applications is greatly appreciated. They all are professionals in their own rights, and it's summer, so we're asking a lot of them. So we do have that kind of roster pretty much solidified at this point for that. We also do a soundness and review and due diligence review with a set of contractors. What we'll do with that is those considerations from those contractors as they review the applications will then be provided to OAHP staff prior to the technical committee, where those rankings, where we'll have kind of the discussion and ranking. And then we will incorporate those, present those considerations as staff to the rest of the committee so they can have that in their full discussion. Staff will be doing site visits to each application prior to the technical committee. We're doing it this way rather than trying to coordinate with 8 reviewers across the state to 10 applications to do site visits that involve the entire technical committee, just due to logistic challenges and wanting to kind of not create a situation where we have some projects and applications that receive more participation from review committees than others. And so the way we're approaching this is staff will visit each project location. We will ask our reviewers up front if there's any clarifications they'd like to see based off of the application, and then we'll be able to kind of bring that to the applicants during the site visit. So they will have that opportunity to kind of have some interaction with the application and the applicants through that process. And then we will kind of present the I don't want to say results of our site visit, but essentially any additional considerations based off application information, if there's any clarifications that were made during those site visits to the technical committee at the technical committee meeting. And then once we have that meeting, those rankings will be presented to be incorporated into the evaluations that we will then as staff present to you all, the commission, for review, that will then inform the funding recommendation that we put together at your meeting to the board. So we wanted to just give you all kind of an upfront kind of review of what that process will look like, so that you know at the commission meeting in November, when the evaluations are coming to you, what the process was and kind of the roster of experience and expertise that we have reviewing these applications. Happy to answer questions, or we can move forward. Ed.
Yes, just a clarifying question, since we just spent 2 hours with the reviewing the division rules. The current review process is based on the old rules, right? For this round of funding?
Yep.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a great consideration. All of our applications that we have right now will be evaluated based off the evaluation criteria that is currently in rule right now. So our reviewers will work through it, and you all will have one last chance to work through the evaluation criteria as they currently exist.
Okay, thank you, Robin.
Yep.
Okay, Bruce.
You're muted, Bruce.
You're muted.
We are moving on to item E, economic values to support an Oregon agricultural heritage program, payment for ecosystem services program. And this is a product that is years in the making. We've all been waiting with bated breath. Barbara, I will turn it over to you unless Taylor, Robin, Renee, anybody has any introductory remarks there?
I think Barbara hardly needs an introduction at this point. It's been years in the making. We're really excited to be at this stage in the process. And yeah, I think Barbara is just going to walk us through the methodology, where we're at, and then we can hopefully have a little time for discussion at the end and answer questions about next steps. So Barbara, if you're able to share your screen, feel free and take it away.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for having me at the meeting. Has it popped up for everyone, the screen?
Yes, it's only a half screen.
Mm-hmm. Takes up all my screen. Let's see. Let's do. How's
There
that?
we go. Yep.
Okay. So this is very similar to the presentation from last time. So I'm going to go over kind of quickly the things that we covered last time. Just pause me, interrupt me, raise your hand. I can't see all of you, but
I'll keep an eye out.
Yeah, perfect. That'd be great. If there's any questions, if I'm going too quickly on the early slides that kind of lay out the framework. and then we'll get into the values, which have shifted a little bit from the last time we talked. So just want to start again with the objectives, and this was developed with OAHP staff. So the purpose is to value the ecosystem services that result from conservation practices, and on agricultural land, specifically no forest lands were included. So the goals for valuation first is really to make it easy and inexpensive to implement. So not making it as simple as possible, and both for implementation from the OAHP side, but also for landowners, that they understand it, that there's certainty with it, that they don't know, well, if I do this practice, you know, I don't know what my payment is till 5 years down the road, but more like they know up front what the payment's going to be for any given practice. And then it's adaptable and flexible across the whole state, given the diversity of the state and the diversity of farms in the state. And then finally, we wanted the payments to be, you know, really match as well as we could what the value of the benefit was that would be received. And that, as one of the public commenters, or I think several of you pointed out, consistent with the NRCS practices was viewed as really important. So those were all of the objectives we had as we thought about how to structure the payment and the valuation process. So the benefit types that we valued were water quality, and specifically sediment and nutrients, terrestrial habitat, aquatic habitat, and aquatic habitat is really land-based practices such as riparian restoration that affect aquatic habitat, not in-stream measures. And then finally, carbon sequestration. So the first way to think about this is we focus on outcomes. And one of the commenters noted that if it's focused on outcomes, that your ability to have your payment be commensurate with the value of the practice is better if you're outcome based, because you're really focused on what's the amount of benefit that's being provided, and we're paying for that. Second, we tried to really keep costs low, that whole easy and inexpensive to implement. And I think this was also noted by one of the commenters, public comments, that overhead and administrative costs can be quite high if it's a monitored system. So this is a system that we're focused on outcomes, but it's practice-based payment and not payments based on a measured outcome after the practice is implemented. And finally, certainty, easy of understanding for landowners. So again, the payment per practice is set, where it doesn't vary. And it's also recognizing that measuring and monitor-based systems, it's still developing. So there's a lot of uncertainty even when you're monitoring the outcomes. So with those in mind, the process we took was a 3-step process. First, identify which practices would be eligible that provide high public value and benefits for habitat, carbon, and water quality. Second, quantify the environmental benefit that's expected from each of those practices. And then third, put an economic value on that environmental benefit. So each of these 3 steps has uncertainty and can be quite challenging. So we ended up with like a 100-page document or something for this valuation process. But those are the 3 main steps. So I want to talk about which payments or which practices are eligible, the first step. So this is really based on NRCS, because we're really trying to be consistent with NRCS practices. So NRCS has 167 practices, and they rate the physical effects or the environmental outcomes expected from those practices, from 5 being substantial improvement down to -5 of substantial worsening. The physical effects you can kind of wrap up into about 5 different public benefit categories: water quality, habitat, carbon, air quality, and water quantity. In our early interviews with folks about what the program should focus on, the first 3 of water quality, habitat, and carbon really rose to the top. No one mentioned air quality, and water quantity dropped out because it was mainly an infrastructure-based practice that was more of like a capital improvement that was costly. And so we decided to drop all infrastructure from the eligible practices. So that's why water quantity dropped out. Laura?
Barbara, we have a clarifying question from Laura.
Can you remind me why temperature isn't on the list? Because obviously that's a big one when we talk about water quality a lot of the time.
Yeah, great question. We actually put that's really actually in the aquatic habitat. So you could kind of put it under wildlife quality, but we put it with aquatic habitat because that's how it's listed in the NRCS. So that's a primary benefit of the aquatic habitat is really temperature regulation. Great question.
Thank you.
Okay. So the values. So the first one, several public comments on this. Great public comments on the carbon payments. So this is this gives both for in-field practices and for habitat-based practices, the values that we came up with. The first couple of columns are the environmental benefit in terms of the sequestration expected from the literature. The fourth column is the value, the economic value, that third step. How do we think about value for carbon sequestration? So several of the commenters noted the social cost of carbon is the value to the public of reduced carbon in the atmosphere. And that value is much, much higher than this $10 that we have currently in the payment document. So the current, and this has been constantly shifting. So the science is evolving and we're understanding more and more about effects of climate change and the economic impacts. So these values are constantly being updated and reviewed. The EPA, just after we finished this draft valuation document, the EPA moved from, there was a federal working group that had established about $50 per ton of carbon dioxide. And just after we finished this draft document, the EPA came out with proposed of more like $190 to $200. So a fourfold increase really recently from the EPA. So that is the value of reducing long-term 1 ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. What we're looking at is what's the value of primarily soil storage of carbon, but also vegetation in the forms of trees, the sequestration. And the reason we ended up going with a lower value here was twofold. One, the questions around how permanent is this sequestration, how certain is the amount being sequestered. There's a lot of variation in the literature about the amount being sequestered in any of these practices. And then also we were trying to be aligned with what other state agencies were planning to use under this program. So not under the OAHP program, but under the state funding for, and initially, Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was initially the feedback we were getting was around this $10 per CO2. And so that's where we landed, both to recognize maybe the additionality from the practice, the permanence of the sequestration, and then alignment with other agencies. So, and this question here is less, I think, of an economic question. I think that the value, the public benefit of 1 reduced ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is much higher than $10. Like, that's clear. I think the EPA around 200 is a really pretty accurate number from all the literature I've read. This question is more about how certain are we, how conservative do we want to be, and how aligned do we want to be with other agencies in the state. So this is where we have it right now, but there's definite room for adjustment depending on how the program wants to value and incentivize carbon. Taylor, do you have anything to add? I've kind of droned on for a long time about this. Do you have anything you want to add here?
I mean, I think you did a pretty good job of covering it. We skewed conservative on the value for carbon for the reasons you talked about. One, we don't have any assurance that the practice will stay in place after we make the payment for implementing it. Also most of these carbon practices also have associated habitat and water quality benefits. So the total payment for any given practice is often much higher than just the carbon value. So I mean, for those two reasons, the uncertainty and the sort of like bundled payments, we kind of skewed conservative on the carbon payment. So I think it's also a healthy exercise, for the commission to think through. This is going to be a bit of a living document as we go through time, and, prices do not stay static, values may change. And so we will need to develop our skills around working with this document and thinking about how we as a program and as a commission adjust values as we go through time, given new information and or a change in priorities. But Bruce, I see you have a question.
Yeah, Barbara, can you just remind those of us who bundling versus stacking, the point that Taylor was making there?
Yeah, great question. So for ecosystem services, any given practice can have different types of benefits. And some practices might provide just one benefit, maybe just sequestration of carbon. But other practices, like riparian buffers is kind of a prime example, provide all of the benefits. They shade riparian areas and provide aquatic habitat, temperature, and stream flow regulation and different types of benefits for aquatic habitat. They also provide terrestrial habitat for songbirds and other types of fish and other types of wildlife. And then they also provide water quality benefits. So some practices provide all of those benefits, and we want to incentivize the practices with the highest total value. And we can separately, there's challenges in separating those values, but we worked hard to not double count. So if a practice provides both water quality and aquatic habitat, we're separately looking at the temperature versus the sediment versus the nitrogen kind of thing. So when we talk about stacking those types of benefits, it's looking at the cumulative benefit to the public of all of those benefits. And not double dipping, being careful to say, if fish is the reason why we care about water quality and temperature, we're not counting the value of fish under nitrogen, sediment, and temperature, but really trying to get the value of fish for count it once.
So that is part of the answer to people who say we're valuing carbon too low. It's bigger because we're talking about more than just carbon sequestration through these payments.
Well, so for carbon, it's not low because we're considering other values. If we're thinking about incentivizing landowners, it's not just the carbon payment, it's the payment adding in all the other benefits as well. So for, riparian buffers, it's not $10, it's, it's $485. But for carbon itself, the reason why we're low is not because we're including those other values, but because we're being conservative. We're not sure about for carbon to have long-term beneficial and for sequestration to have long-term benefits to society, it has to be permanently sequestered and not, if you reduce till and then you go and till the next year, you're releasing a lot of that soil carbon. So it was more because of the uncertainty about the long-term sequestration, the alignment with the other agencies, and whether this is truly additional sequestration versus what would happen without the program. Those were more the reasons why it's low.
Thank you.
Taylor, can I jump in here?
Please.
I'm sorry. I don't have a way to raise my hand that I know of. But Barbara, I'll throw a scenario out at you, I guess. Yeah, I'm a farmer. I grow blueberries, and blueberries got to be grown on well-drained soil, and they can't flood. So consequently, I'm not in an area where there's riparian. I'm not in a riparian zone. I'm, good quality, well-drained land that I irrigate. But, I think blueberries in some ways would be an excellent way to sequester carbon, but I can guarantee it, those rates, I'm not going to be able to sequester carbon. Those rates don't make any sense for me, and I don't have the type of land, I don't think, that I can stack on those other benefits with. So how do you respond to that?
So if I've understood correctly, Doug, you're saying that asking about the potential for getting payments for expanding acreage of blueberries, thinking that
No.
Oh, no.
No. Because we do not till our blueberries. So once they're planted, we establish sod in the aisles. The rows are never cultivated. We irrigate them all summer long, obviously, but because we're not tilling that soil for 20 or 30 years, I think you could make an excellent case that we're sequestering carbon. But at these values, I wouldn't be interested in going through the procedures to try and figure it out.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of issues there. One is, what are the values that would truly incentivize people to adopt a new practice? And are we in the ballpark of incentivizing? And I think with that, what we were trying to do from a value perspective, I mean, I think it gets the question between valuing public benefits and then also thinking about, on the ground implementation. How is this actually, from a policy side and from a implementation side, what values are really going to encourage folks to adopt these practices? So we were trying to stay on, well, what's the public value, and not branching over too much into the implementation side. And the public value may not be high enough to incentivize. And just assuming we get the public value correct, if that public value is lower than the cost of the practice, then it doesn't make sense for us to pay the cost of the practice. I'm not saying that that's the case. We were trying to be pretty conservative here. So these values might be too low compared to the actual public value, but we were trying to represent that as well as we could.
Yeah. I look at it, I'm already doing the practices, but I don't think going through the procedures and the headaches to try and get it quantified would be worth my time at those prices, even though I'm already doing the practices.
Well, just to jump in here, Doug, I mean, so it's basically what we're proposing here is a subset of eligible NRCS practices. So if there are certain NRCS conservation practices that would make sense on your farm, for instance, conservation cover in between your blueberry rows. If you were to apply that practice and you have it in place, you would be, and you have an associated conservation management plan, you'd be eligible for the payment for that practice, which that has a carbon benefit, but it also has a water quality benefit. And so the total payment per acre is $225 per acre per year. So every year that you have that practice in place, you would be eligible for that payment, and so on and so forth with other practices. But for each operation, yeah, it's going to be a different suite of conservation practices that would be potentially useful, and it's not going to be the whole kit caboodle. We just we're trying to incentivize that like subset of practices that are eligible through NRCS that have the highest public benefit, as calculated through this methodology.
Yeah, I'm just trying to point out we're only going to incentivize these landowners that are eligible to stack these benefits there's still going to be a significant amount of land, if not most of the land, out there that's being farmed. It's not going to make any sense to do any of this. But anyway.
So are you suggesting the payments ought to be higher? Just so I make sure I'm capturing your feedback here.
I just don't think the carbon payments are high enough. Yeah.
Okay.
That's where I'm at.
Thanks for that. Renee?
Actually, let's go to Laura first
Laura.
and then I can comment after.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Doug. I think this potentially, I mean, well, two things. One is I think this is a great start and really important work to be doing. And I share Doug's concern that we go through this whole process and nobody adopts it. So just keeping that in mind, Doug, maybe, I mean, I think you understand this, Doug, but I'll just say it out loud. And Taylor, maybe this was what you were getting at. Really, the way this makes sense in the is to add multiple practices, because none of these as a singular thing is likely to make it worth my while to be in a contract with NRCS. It's only when I mean, the only time I have done contracts with NRCS is when multiple things line up and you can get enough payments to sort of make all the paperwork worth your while. So I share your concern, Doug, and hopefully we can get there, because obviously these things do have public benefit, and I would love to see us, you know, pay farmers enough to make it worth their while to do more of them.
Thanks, Laura. And sorry about that, but I haven't found it. I haven't been in an NRCS program for 20 years because they're so out of touch and doesn't make any sense to me. But so let's go on.
Yeah. Well, you'll be happy to know you do not have to participate in an NRCS program to participate in the CMP program, but it's just designed to play nice with each other. Renee?
Yeah, just briefly, Taylor. I think this is the issue for us to grapple with, right? Is the question of too low, too high. We, you know, alignment given the conversations, interagency conversations about the National Working Lands funding, but being mindful of what Doug and Laura both just said. If this isn't incentivizing, then that in and of itself is a serious obstacle. So it's the importance of coming out of the gate to test drive something. And I think being very clear on, we will have to do a lot of adaptive management and learning and tracking what some of those new trends and research are showing on this front. So I hear you, and I think we'll have to just strike that balance of not setting a market too low or too high, and also being mindful of the funding that we have available currently for it. But that also shouldn't hamstring us too much from the outset. I think we have to have defensible numbers, and Barbara's done a great job to give us that starting point, as Laura said. Thanks.
One other thing on carbon that I forgot to mention is these values. So the primary carbon markets for agriculture are in the Midwest, and on a per acre value, the payments we have here are fairly commensurate with the per acre payments for practices that are being done in the Midwest. So that was another factor that kind of played into this as well. So getting off carbon and moving to water quality. Similar, you know, we're looking at what's the estimated reduced pollutant load per acre of the practice, quantify that, quantify the dollar value per unit of that reduction in load, and then come up with what that value per acre is. For water quality, we did use, we looked at infield practices, and then we looked at edge of field practices. And the edge of field captures a larger drainage area. And so based on that, the edge of field practices have a 15 times higher benefit in this valuation methodology. So you can see there's one column for infield practices and one for edge of field. And those are based on that sort of assumed catchment area and filtration area for those edge of field practices. And we did change this from the last rendition from 20, which there were several things from NRCS and some other literature sources that indicated it's sort of a 20-to-1, but we reduced it to 15 to be a little more conservative on this. Any questions on water quality before we move to habitat?
I don't see any.
So terrestrial habitat and aquatic habitat, like we talked about before, aquatic habitat is mainly focused on temperature and fish. And then terrestrial habitat is a wide spectrum of wildlife focus there and vegetation. So these values are, you can see the list on the right of eligible practices. Many practices have habitat eligibility. It's primarily, you can see edge of field practices. There's very few infield practices that rank highly from NRCS for habitat. Any questions on these? So this summarizes the value per type of practice, or sorry, per benefit, that if a practice qualifies. So if it's an edge of field practice and it qualifies for, based on the NRCS physical effects rating for sediment, it would be a $90 per acre. If it qualifies for nutrients and its edge of field, it'd be $135. And then depending on the vegetation type for carbon, it could be $10 or $5 if it qualifies for carbon. So you add up those values across horizontally to get on the far right column the maximum value if all the services were provided by practice of what the value per acre would be. Any questions on kind of how this framework works? The idea here is that as we update values, like let's say we decide that from an implementation perspective and a policy perspective, we want to use something closer to the social cost of carbon, that we feel confident in the long-term sequestration of these practices in the way we're implementing the program. We could change that $10 per ton to $30 a ton or $50 a ton. And we would just easily then, we could update all the values for the practices that have carbon. So it's intended to be an easy update if values were to change. This is just gives some math on a few practices. So for example, pasture and hay planting has terrestrial habitat and it has carbon. And so as terrestrial habitat, we get $100, and then from carbon, we get $5 because it's grass and not tree or shrub to equal $105. So for each one, it's kind of walks you through, like, does it qualify in the physical effects? Yes. Okay, what value do we pull for that benefit? And then go to the next benefit and do the same process, and you add them up to come up with the payment per acre. Any questions? Okay, I'm seeing Taylor shake his head.
No, yeah, I'm keeping an eye out.
Okay.
You must be being very clear.
So these just give the first one gave carbon. These are water quality eligible practices or habitat. And this just gives you the total value for each practice, kind of summarizes it. This is in the main document also. And then, oh, this is a little funny animation here. So I wanted to talk a little bit about also, so we were focused on what's the value of the payment. Sorry, what's the value economically of the public benefits provided by practices? But in the back of our mind the whole time was that there is this review process that's going to look at the proposed practices on any given farm or ranch and say, you know, and basically vet it and verify that it will provide benefit and it's an appropriate practice. So it's, I think, a really important part in thinking about these values and in thinking about the implementation, that these values were developed with that in mind, that there was this review and approval process to make sure that public benefits would actually be generated. So that's partly what made us feel more comfortable with having a set value per acre, because we knew there was this site-specific analysis that would occur. With that, also, we just had a few thoughts as we went through this about considerations that might be pertinent for the CMP review and project selection. So one is thinking about any given practice can be implemented in different ways, and some of those implementation factors can have more value. So for example, if you're planting a riparian area, the size of the tree that you establish will have an effect on the immediate benefits. So the larger the more there's vegetation, the larger the trees that are established, the more immediately you'll get the temperature benefits and other things. So the size of the tree, or if you're replanting pasture, are you doing native or non-native vegetation? Those types of factors, there's flexibility within the practice. So the way it's being proposed to be implemented can have an effect on value. We've talked a lot about additionality with the carbon. Would this sequestration occur without the program? Are we, and that might be okay from an implementation. We might say we want to compensate good stewardship that's occurring, but we also maybe want to think about, are our funds, how are we changing environmental outcomes with using these public funds? So additionality is another aspect that may be pertinent in thinking about which projects to fund. Another is, what are the existing conditions on the site, and what's the environmental uplift that's possible? So if you're thinking about something like soil sequestration, if the current state of the soils can influence what the accumulation of additional carbon can be in those soils. Similarly, if you have an area that's not doing much erosion, there's not much soil erosion, if your benefit from a sediment retention and reducing sediment load into waterways may be lower than an area that has high erosion. So these are some of these are pretty common sense, obvious things, but just want to sort of point out, these are some things to think about. And then there may be other site-specific considerations that the value of a given environmental improvement may be higher in a specific location, either for ecological reasons, like it's a big migration area, or it's an area that's critical habitat for a certain species that's threatened. That may give it a higher ecological importance and therefore a higher economic value. And then there may also be socioeconomic factors that may give it a higher economic value, such as water quality in an area that's a watershed that's being used for municipal water supply, or that has really high recreation value that's sensitive to water quality. That might provide a higher value for improvements there. And then finally, the last thing might be cumulative considerations. What other restoration, what other practices are being done near this farmer ranch? And how does the CMP play a role in whatever restoration objectives or conservation objectives are occurring and are important in that region? And that's all I have, Taylor.
Great. Well, I'm glad we saved a couple of minutes here at the end for questions, and we can just kind of talk about what our next steps are going forward. But Stephanie, you want to jump in here?
Hey, thank you, Barbara. So I had a question. I think you mentioned trying to harmonize these values or keep them consistent with the price of carbon that other state agencies were using. Could you talk about that a little more?
Yeah, so this was pretty preliminary. And Taylor, maybe you could jump in here also. This was back in, I want to say in November, where we tried to, given that it was state funding across several agencies, we were trying to understand what the other agencies were thinking of in terms of valuation of carbon to see for alignment. And part of the thinking there is, if the state can pay for carbon sequestration on forest lands and it costs X per ton, then that's a really good use of state. If we don't want to be paying on agricultural lands if it costs more per ton than on state lands and things like that. So that was kind of the thinking behind it. And we got some preliminary feedback. And Taylor, remind me, was it from ODF or?
Yeah, and I'm just trying to find that correspondence, but
I think I want to say it was ODF, and it was around this $10 per ton, but it was very preliminary. So, I think carbon's been the hardest. carbon's the easiest to value economically, but to determine the right value for this program has been one of the hardest things, I would say, because of these questions. So I'm sorry, Stephanie, that was a bit of a non-answer. But we can look at
Okay, no, that it's
correspondence.
just getting the wheels turning in terms of like kind of what are some other places we could check and stuff. So no, thank you, Barbara, that helps.
Do we have other questions? I'm just gonna say, I used to think, boy, this is really complicated, but the valuation is the really hard part. Now I'm thinking, oh no. Gets more complicated once you even establish the valuation. How do you actually implement a grant program around this? But
That's our next step, Bruce.
I would say all steps are hard here.
Yeah, so I was just gonna jump in and say, sort of on that note, next steps. So next steps are, we're gonna be working to do an engagement process with potential applicants, interested parties, about how to best roll this out, given the work Barbara's done as sort of a jumping off point. But how do we actually turn these values for these conservation practices into a fully fleshed out program that is going to get results on the ground? Like, how do we make this as impactful as possible? So that's going to be ongoing over the next couple of months. And then that's going to be incorporated into guidance documents and a grant application. And so there's going to be a lot of legwork to do on sort of the guidance around how do we take these values that we've established and roll out a program that meets those goals Barbara was talking about in the beginning. You know, it's easy to implement, relatively affordable as far as overhead goes, well aligned with NRCS, so on and so forth. And so there's going to be chances for engagement, both as commissioners, and I'll be leaning on you a little bit to make sure we're getting the right voices in the room as we're doing this engagement process. Because as Doug was alluding to, you know, it's important that this program is a useful tool for folks. You know, it's my hope that it can be a synthesizing tool and help folks kind of do the planning work and bring all of these different conservation practices and programs together in a way that can really incentivize their uptake. The last thing we want to do is create, you know, additional hoops to jump through. So it'll be a balancing act, and I look forward to that puzzle and working through it with you all.
Okay, if there's nothing else on this, where are we? I can't see the agenda at the moment here. Are we ready to wrap it up?
Yeah, you were at 5 o'clock. And the agenda says other business, if there is other business. Otherwise, we're at the end of the agenda.
I think, Doug, it's your role to shut this thing down.
And I'm anxious to do it because I'm supposed to be getting out to a blueberry field that we're supposed to be picking tonight. So, yee-haw! Okay, if nobody has any objections, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you.